Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of the Cornell Historic Preservation Planning Alumni Virtual Symposium. My name is Michelle Van Meter. I graduated from the Historic Preservation Planning program in 2018, and I've had the pleasure to serve as chair of the HPPA Symposium Planning Committee this spring. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the purpose of this event is to highlight the work of HPP alumni and current students with a focus on the present challenges and opportunities that we encounter here in the United States and abroad. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have not had the same opportunities to meet in person at conferences that we would during a more typical year. So one of our many hopes for the symposium was for it to serve as a platform for us all to reconnect and share ideas. This event would not have been possible without the support of HPPA members, as well as the guidance, expertise, and encouragement we received from our advisor, Professor Michael Tomlin. I would also like to recognize the hard work and dedication of the other members of the Symposium Planning Committee, including Mayar Hadigi, HPP Class of 2012, Melanie Coulter, HPP Class of 2017, Shannon Salento, also HPP Class of 2017, and current student Zoe Murad. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We would love to see each other's faces, so feel free to turn on your camera if you wish. However, be sure to stay muted while the speakers are presenting. Second, you can change the way in which you see the presentations with or without the audience gallery by clicking the view icon at the top of your screen. Third, at the end of each presentation, please use the raise hand function under the reactions tab to ask a question, or you may use the chat box to type your questions and comments at any time. Finally, we are recording each of these talks, and we will share the recorded videos on the HPPA website within the next week. Our lineup this morning consists of Gretchen and Andy Roblee, HPP classes of 2018 and 2017, who will be presenting on building waste and the case for deconstruction, followed by Maria Gabriela Brito, HPP class of 2015, who will speak on historic preservation in Cordoba, Argentina. Our closing address will be delivered by Sherry Freer, who is a member of the HPP class of 1999 and is the current chief of the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks Program. Gretchen and Andy's discussion, titled The Case for Deconstruction, is a presentation on the concept of deconstruction and its environmental, economic, and social benefits, as opposed to demolition. A counterpoint to that from a preservationist perspective, and a call for preservationists to actively participate now to shape this emerging practice. Gretchen is the director of the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, which works with communities across New York State on planning issues at the intersection of climate resiliency, equity, and the built environment. She also served on the board of Restoration Works International, RWI, which partners with communities to restore their important sites. Through RWI, Gretchen has worked on projects in Mongolia, Nepal, and India. She is an advisor to the Southeast Asian Cultural Heritage Alliance, which promotes community government partnerships for effective cultural heritage management. Andy is a project architectural historian with environmental design and research, landscape architecture, engineering, and environmental services in Syracuse, New York. In addition to holding a Master of Arts degree in Historic Preservation Planning from Cornell, Andy received his bachelor's in history from Wells College. He lives in Auburn with his wife, Devin, and two boys, Alex and Arthur. Andy serves on the City of Auburn Historic Resources Review Board as the current president of the Preservation Association of Central New York, and as a member of the Proud Working Group. Andy is a believer in the idea that all disciplines are connected and can inform each other no matter how different they may seem. He also enjoys long-winded discussions about historical trivia, reading about old plaster, staring at buildings, and writing mediocre songs on the piano and guitar. His words, not mine. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen and Andy to begin their presentation. Oh, Gretchen, I believe that you might be on mute.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. So just thank you so much to the organizing committee, because it's been a really wonderful weekend catching up and hearing what everyone is working on. So thank you, and I hope that there will be more symposiums in our future. So today Andy and I are here to talk with you about the case for deconstruction. And I would call your attention to the photo on the left of the slide. This is a photo of the Chicona block on College Avenue in Ithaca. It was demolished last summer in 2020. And I was part of a salvage team along with Professor Jenny Minner and Historic Ithaca, people from its architectural salvage arm Significant Elements. And prior to the demolition, we went into the building to try to do some salvage. And we weren't interested in soft stripping, which is the term traditionally meaning taking out appliances and air conditioning and furniture that can be reused. We actually wanted to salvage the building materials that created this building when it was built in 1912. And so we had about 5 hours, and in 5 hours, we were able to save some cherry wood tongue and groove paneling, some heavy wooden banisters and railings and spindles, some original stained glass windows from the building, all of which were headed for Significant Elements and resold on to consumers. We were not able to save much else. So for instance, if you remember from your days at CTB, the wonderful tile floor, we were not able to do anything with that. Or the wood from Roelof's bar, the floor planks and the other architectural elements, all of which could likely have been reused. And so the picture that you're looking at on the left is not building waste, it's a wasted resource. And so now I want to take us 40 miles up the road to Auburn, New York, home of Andy Roblee, and tell you a little bit about the Wall Street Church. This Wall Street Church was built in 1887. It replaced a smaller church that was already there, that was part of a Methodist, that housed a Methodist Episcopal congregation. And the congregation outgrew the church, and so they replaced it with this larger building. From its very earliest days, the Methodist Episcopal congregation at this church was known as a biracial abolitionist congregation, and its members included Harriet Tubman's nephew, who in fact was married in the building that preceded this one. This particular church was built in 1887, and the Methodist Episcopal congregation continued here until the mid-90s, when in 1994 it was sold to an AME Zion congregation. And the AME Zion congregation used it, including in 1999 when it was named to the National Register of Historic Places. But the congregation numbers dwindled, and eventually the congregation vacated the church. And it's been vacant now for a number of years, decades. And it fell to disrepair. And in recent years, the city had been fielding calls because neighbors were concerned about roof shingles, bricks, other materials falling onto them or their houses. This is located in a residential neighborhood. It's right across the street from one of the walls of the Auburn Penitentiary. And so a couple of years ago, the city of Auburn tried to reach out to figure out an alternative for this long vacant church. So they contacted the SHPO, they contacted Preservation Association of Central New York, they tried to interest some private buyers in the church. And then they also came to the organization that Andy and I currently serve on, Crowd, which I'll explain about in a moment. And it was clear to Crowd members that the church was headed for demolition. And so we really tried to propose the alternative of a full deconstruction for the materials. And as you can see from these pictures, the brick face on the exterior, the windows, you can't see the doors, but they're there. A very large steeple that contains a very large bell. And then the interior, which is just marvelous. And so these pews, which were designed specifically for the interior by the architect of the church, the trusses. What you don't see in this picture are the amazing wood floor planks and the ceiling planks. The choir loft is all wood, which is where this photo is taken from. And we had identified a direct end user of the deconstructed materials. And so the plan was to send the materials back down the road to Ithaca to an organization called Quarter Acre for the People. And Quarter Acre for the People is located just outside Treeman Park entrance on 15 acres of land. And they are developing a sustainable agriculture farmsteading program for 8 to 12 families of color. And they need to build infrastructure for this community and are committed to using green building principles and using deconstructed materials whenever possible. And so we could be able to provide a whole lot of building materials for them. But the thing that really resonated with everyone involved was the cultural circularity of building materials and the path that they would be taking. So materials that went into a church built in 1887 that provided solace and education and community to a congregation of Black Auburn residents. And then those same building materials traveling down the road to Ithaca to provide solace and education and community to a new congregation of families of color in Ithaca. And so, you know, it would be a remarkable story. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so this picture is a photo of the almost demolished church that was taken within the past 2 weeks, about 10 days ago, I would say. And so that broke a lot of hearts for a lot of reasons. And so leaving the cultural circularity story behind, let's just talk about the environmental problem with this. So by our estimates, the demolition of the Wall Street Church resulted in 800 tons of building debris, which is destined for landfills. We estimate about nearly 700 tons of this is from the brick. Those amazing trusses that you saw in the photo are probably about 9 tons. And then the floor and ceiling wood, which were not captured in the photo, are probably about 30 tons. And that's 30 tons of old growth oak wood, according to various National Register documents and other information on the church. And so we're all familiar with demolitions. They happen all the time. They've probably happened to buildings that we're quite attached to. But this term for demolished building materials is known as construction and demolition debris, CDD. And it's generated here and around the world at tremendous volumes. So in the US alone, we generate more than 600 million tons a year. And to put that in perspective, that's twice the amount of all of the garbage that we throw out all the time. And so as a result of this, it's the largest single component of our landfills in this country. And most of it is coming from demolition rather than new construction. And so late last fall, a group of partners that Andy and I are part of. And CROWD is an acronym for development. And we are working across New York State to promote sustainability and resilience of the built environment. And all of CROWD's members, which I'll talk about in just a moment, will absolutely acknowledge that the best way to promote sustainability and resilience is to keep the buildings in place. But that can't always happen. And so when a building is destined to be demolished, or before that point, we're advocating for full deconstruction and reuse of the building materials, and recognizing the environmental and economic and cultural benefit that that can bring. So CROWD partners include a lot of different people from a lot of different areas. We have faculty members from architecture, art, and planning, including Professor Minner from City and Regional Planning and Professor Felix Heisel from the Architecture Department. We have the heads of area reuse organizations in Central New York, and we have a lot of preservationists, Historic Ithaca members, Preservation Association of Central New York, the Christofferson Center, which I'm a part of, and we also have elected officials and municipal staff as part of our team. And we have a lot of students who really want to be able to meaningfully promote a sustainable built environment. So we're working in 4 different areas. We are working on community education and engagement. We're taking the research, which is produced by faculty and students, and transforming it into consumer-friendly resources. We're developing policy and practice recommendations for local municipalities, and we're starting work on equitable green workforce development and what that would look like with deconstruction as the centerpiece of that. And so the ultimate goal is to create a circular construction and building economy in New York State, maybe in the region, maybe in the country. And so circular economy is keeping the materials that we have in use in this closed loop. And so they're not leaving the loop to go to a landfill or to a waste site. They're being reused and recycled. And so essentially it's making use of materials that already exist. Unfortunately, the term that many proponents for this practice use is urban mining. Despite that unfortunate term, there's a lot of benefits to a circular economy. So there are environmental benefits. Obviously, diverting these building materials from landfills is a really important piece of this. It's also recognizing the embodied carbon, which is contained in all of our infrastructure, not just even buildings, but bridges, roads, sidewalks. And perhaps by reusing these materials, we can also decrease the production of new materials, often which are damaging to the environment. Concrete production, for instance, may account for 5 to 10% of the world's carbon emissions. We have new materials like vinyl, lumber, carpet treated with chemicals, trucked in from far, far away. So there are obvious environmental benefits to the reuse of building materials. There's also the cultural and social values. So obviously, there may not be a situation where the materials from one site being reused in another have such a cultural connection so deeply as the Wall Street Church and Quarter Acre for the People. But the reuse of these materials can nonetheless celebrate the history, the craftsmanship, the work that went into creating the building in the first place. There's also the thinking that as deconstruction becomes more commonly practiced, it can lead architects and engineers potentially to design buildings and new materials that are more environmentally friendly. There's also the economic benefit. Creating jobs is an important part of this, and these jobs by their nature tend to be local, and so you're benefiting the local economy. But there's also the supply and demand and cost situation. So if anybody has had any experience or had to have had an experience in the building materials sector recently, you will know that building materials in many cases are at their all-time high. The cost of lumber was at an all-time high in May. It had increased more than 370% year on year between 1920 and 1921. So a typical standard supply of lumber, which normally costs $200 to $400, now costs more than $1,600. Plywood went up 10% recently in the blink of an eye. And so a lot of this has to do with supply. There isn't enough building materials. And so by reusing building materials from deconstructed sites, we're adding to the supply of materials. But there's also the scarcity of high quality building materials that have been used, say, prior to 1940. So if you're buying lumber today, you're buying lumber that looks like the picture in the upper right from 2018. You're not buying the lumber from 100 years ago. Old growth lumber no longer exists. And so the only way that you get old growth lumber is if you salvage it yourself from a building built before 1940 roughly, or you find someone who has salvaged it who will sell it on to you. And obviously from that picture, the old growth lumber is a far superior product to what we're producing now. There are 4 main obstacles currently to deconstruction. There is cost, which is a big obstacle. It costs far more to deconstruct a building than to demolish it. There's also the time consideration. So deconstructing takes more time. Planning the deconstruction takes more time now than demolition. There's also a concern about whether we have ample storage for the materials. There are a lot of materials that are generated from the deconstruction of a building. And so until the market economy takes hold and starts to be able to move these products, these reused materials effectively, how can we find the storage capacity for all of these different types of building materials? And then finally, there's the policy aspect. Very, very few municipalities in the United States have a policy that favors deconstruction or that mentions deconstruction at all. So Crowd, although we have been working with specific communities in New York State, is also really trying to elevate the conversation about deconstruction to a statewide level. And so there are a number of initiatives that we've undertaken or are starting to undertake to try to do that. One is partnering with organizations that exist statewide that do some form of demolition. So for instance, the Association of New York State Land Banks, of which there are 24, 25, that work across the state, many of whom end up demolishing some of their properties. We are talking to New York State agencies about advocating for a fund that would incentivize deconstruction until the price for deconstruction becomes more on par with demolition. We have done a lot of work developing data-driven policy initiatives that we can work with individual municipalities to help pass. And so it's a case of one size doesn't fit all for favorable deconstruction policies. And so really looking at data from the city or town's demolition records and assessing the capacity of the local planning staff and building inspectors in terms of being able to bring in the practice of deconstruction into their planning. We are developing best practice guidelines for how to treat and remove materials that are common in building typologies around New York State. And as I mentioned, we're starting work on equitable workforce training and development programs around deconstruction. We would love to create a database of sites that may at some point be at risk of demolition so that we may be able to intervene earlier. And by intervene, I don't necessarily mean intervene for deconstruction. As I mentioned earlier, everyone involved in the Crowd Task Force realizes that the best way to create or promote a sustainable, resilient built environment is to use the buildings and the infrastructure that we have already. We are working to create a deconstruction work group for the Northeast of the country, which is modeled on one of our favorite groups called the Bay Area Deconstruction Work Group, whose members include a lot of West Coast municipalities that are actively involved in the deconstruction sector. We're looking at the market case for a circular construction economy and what that would mean in terms of the private market. And then we would at some point like to develop a long-term tax incentive for deconstruction, analogous in a way to the state preservation tax credit. Oops. And so it's our hope that through the work that we're doing now with Crowd and our partners in New York State, that we will be able to get to a point in New York State where residents and municipalities come to view building waste the same way that currently we view food waste and plastic bags and single-use plastics like water bottles, that it's bad and it's unnecessary. And so we hope that very soon, many, many people all over the state and perhaps the country will realize that there is environmental, economic, and cultural benefit to viewing buildings and their building materials as a valuable resource rather than worthless waste. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Can you all see my screen? Perfect, perfect. So, yeah, I would like to say before I begin that I am a member of Crowd, and I do believe in the concept of deconstruction as an end-of-life, last house on the block option for historic properties. So this is framed not so much as an argument against deconstruction, but a kind of supplemental warning. And as I find myself being more involved I also tread carefully, and I'm wary of the process. And so I just want to go over some of those thoughts that I've had. And much of what I'm going to go over relies on a commentary that was co-authored between myself and Professor Jenny Minner for an upcoming compendium on sustainable construction by Professors Dirk Hebel and Felix Heisel. I just want to give a shout out to Jenny. She's involved with Crowd through her leadership of the Just Places Lab at Cornell, which is a platform for multidisciplinary research, and creative action, which is centered on igniting community imagination around just places in the built environment. The conversation on circular economy is incomplete without the consideration of reuse, care, maintenance, and retrofitting of existing buildings. Historic preservation and building reuse should be deeply incorporated within what is defined as sustainable architecture and construction practices. So with this brief presentation, I'm going to offer a counterpoint to the general concept of deconstruction, and will argue unequivocally that there must be limits to the so-called urban mine, and that potential deconstruction policies need to be vetted by preservationists, and preservationists need to be involved right now. Historic preservation has long critiqued the rapid spread of urban development and the disposability of the built environment, and has tried to offer alternatives. Within the US, historic preservation has grown from a simple heritage mission of saving landmarks and creating patriotic shrines to a wider set of ethical concerns and practices. These include, as you all know, a robust and growing set of strategies for achieving environmental sustainability and social equity through the care and repair for the built environment. Yet despite the expansion of its conceptual parameters, preservation remains a largely untapped reservoir of knowledge for circular economy, although it is perhaps the quintessentially sustainable practice. After all, the greenest building is the one that's already been built. And here's a photo of the ruins of the Wall Street Church. To the right, you'll see my field assistant, Arthur Roblee. My slides are out of order, sorry about that. Historic places of worship in urban and neighborhoods face acute threats, not only due to high costs of building repair and maintenance, but also because they are more apt for consolidation with other nearby congregations, and may be in neighborhoods facing high levels of poverty and population decline. Once closed, there are often substantial challenges in finding new, economically viable uses that can sustain architecturally intricate buildings with large auditoriums. In the case of the Wall Street Church, even with historic tax credits and other incentives, the potential of sparking redevelopment in the small neighborhood as an anchor, it received little interest from real estate professionals, local or otherwise. I was part of a team put together by the city of Auburn to go through the church with a local real estate professional who is actually specializes in historic properties, and due to its location and the state that it was in, he had very little hope of its being resold. I hoped against hope, but of course that ship has sailed. The church was built to serve its 19th century working class neighborhood, but as congregations shrank and merged with others due to dwindling church attendance across the country, buildings like the Wall Street Methodist Church are brought to crossroads. For the Wall Street Church, the unfortunate convergence of a bad location, a risk-averse municipality, absentee ownership, and the usual misunderstanding of the cost and benefits of preserving a building brought about its ultimate doom. When all hope of saving a building like the Wall Street Church seems lost, Deconstruction and salvage may offer the opportunity for sustainable reuse of building materials. This presents a dilemma for preservationists, or at least it did and continues to for me. Preservationists, like me, are usually so deeply invested in the saving of a building that even the salvaging of materials may seem like a small but meaningful victory for the intangible value of the property. This, however, may only be a Pyrrhic victory. The economic, environmental, and cultural impact of deconstruction as an alternative to building reuse absolutely must be scrutinized before a building is taken apart and consigned to the salvage yard or the recycling facility. Areas of economic hardships, often with plenty of vacant and deteriorating building stock, may fall victim to traditional mining's paradox of plenty when it comes to the so-called urban mine, in which places with an abundance of resources suffer the negative effects as the result of the material's extraction. When places become simply collections of commodified material, devastation follows without clear rules, boundaries and backstops. To recognize the built environment as a place of precious materials, society must find ways to prevent the wanton extraction of materials for new construction, especially when the systems of the past can more effectively stem the flow of waste to landfills. So the metaphor of urban mining of building materials for reuse is problematic. Communities should never be the sites of disposable construction and intensive extraction, or else they may fall victim to the same negative economic, environmental, and cultural impacts as traditional mining operations. Policies of deconstruction, if not written properly, have the potential to accelerate construction and demolition waste and embodied energy expenditures if they eclipse the art of keeping existing buildings in place. If we deconstruct the premise of deconstruction and reuse of building materials, we may actually find that it reinforces an anti-preservationist foundation, because it is fueled by the demand for reconfiguration and reconstitution of building materials. It tacitly acknowledges, despite what it may outwardly profess, that the qualitative value of architecture is in its novelty and contemporary design, not on its historic and cultural value as a place. Deconstruction ultimately annihilates place. In the final analysis, the true preservation of a building can only be acknowledged to have happened if the building remains substantially whole, or at the very least recognizable as an expression of its original intended use. Circularity, or circular economies, are by definition systems aimed at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources. They seek to close the loop of extraction and manipulation of finite elements from the earth. Yet just as the greenest building is the one that's already been built, surely in terms of energy expenditure and material use, the most closed loop of all is an extant building. Deconstruction, for all its benefits, must be scrutinized in the coming years. So when it comes to the ultimate fate of an historically or culturally significant building, object, site, or structure, deconstruction must remain the last house on the block. The preservationist is uniquely qualified to stand at the intersection of planning, environmentalism, cultural connections, and construction and demolition to drive the discourse on this emerging and evolving concept. The end. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen and Andy, for that excellent presentation. Looks like we already have quite a few comments in the chat box here, and I'd like to open it up for additional comments and questions from the audience. Looks like Matthew has a question, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, this is a great presentation. Thanks for giving it. I've been looking forward to this because it's a topic that I've thought about a lot in Georgia. There's the Historic Preservation Division here has a very strong stance against any form of deconstruction or salvage. And so we've had issues where properties that are going through rehabilitation for a tax credit, or I've had rehabilitation projects going through Section 106 that have proposed using salvage materials and have been basically, the HPD has not approved it because they have a very firm stance against the idea of salvage, that they're concerned that that would essentially lead to urban mining. And it's something that's always bothered me because I think that there is a middle ground there, and I've had conversations with different members of HPD here about how, like, there could be a program, you know, to certify architectural salvage, to really send preservation professionals out when there really is no saving a building, when it's reached that point, and we are at the crossroads of either losing the materials and losing everything, or, you know, getting something from it. And I've wondered if there is a way of looking at this as sort of data recovery for a building. You know, if whenever we're going to plow through an archaeological site and there's nothing to be done about it, we mitigate that loss by doing everything we can to see what is in that area that's going to be disturbed. And I feel like there is room for that with buildings as well. So it's definitely something that I'm very interested in, and I look forward to sharing what you've shared today with people here in Georgia.
Gretchen, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Both of us. I would just say thanks, Matthew, for all your comments. I don't know of any current municipality which is doing what you suggest, which is certifying the materials, which I think is a really interesting idea. And I would love to talk more about that. But I'm also wondering if you've become involved in any deconstruction work groups similar to Crowd, because they do exist, and it's a lot of really generous sharing of information and ideas and resources. And so I can connect you to some if that would be helpful.
Please do. I'm not aware of any down here, but I would be, maybe there needs to be one. So please do.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, Matthew, is that at least in New York State, as we're coming to understand, once the demolition contract is signed, the building materials then technically become the property of the demolition contractor. Mm-hmm. And so what we're seeing is that through every step, there's a new person to shift the conversation to. So first, we're trying to find the owner of the building. That didn't work. Now we're talking to the city because they're the ones who are working to demolish the building, although they worked with us very well, I have to say. Then the last person is the demolition contractor. And as you can imagine, at each step of the way, you have the complete spectrum of personalities and belief systems that you have to really strategize how to approach. So I don't know what it's like in Georgia, if that rule still holds, but you know, you mentioned data collection too. That's one of the things that we are currently foiling. We filed a Freedom of Information law request for the city of Auburn to try and get some information about tonnage and ultimate destinations and stuff like that. So a big part of this is also data collection.
Yeah, it's interesting. We this is very very much on my mind right now. We've got a project in Middle Georgia where essentially we have a building that is in a listed historic district, but is going to be taken for a transportation project, and which is extremely rare down here. It's not a common thing. It's technically not a 106 project, so there is no federal action involved, but we have sort of a mirror legislation where we do a similar process down here for state-funded projects. And I did everything short of chaining myself to the building to keep them from taking it. But you know, essentially it is going to be taken. And right now I'm advocating for a mitigation process that would involve essentially a documented deconstruction. So it could be an educational experience, bring people out from the local community to be involved in it. And because it's in a rather large listed district, we could partner with a local organization to try and store and salvage those materials and use it locally, possibly within the same district, which would be an amazing thing. So this has been really interesting. Thank you.
Just to say that that was the idea of a direct use within a locality or a geography is important at this point, because as I mentioned, the storage of this vast quantities of material becomes problematic because this whole thing is in such early stages of becoming more of a market. And so if you can find a direct use that can take the materials from the site directly, that will stave off one of the challenges that you would face in terms of just saving the materials to document them and figuring out where to put them, where to keep them, what needs special storage and so on. So if you can find a direct use, that would be all the better.
Looks like Barbara had her hand up next.
Hi, everybody. I have a lot of experience in this. This is actually something that I have done, and it is extraordinarily difficult. My parents and I dismantled a single house down to the foundation stone and moved it to another site back in the late 80s. And I can honestly say that it's an extraordinarily time-consuming, and you can't just say, let's do this, because it's not, it is an overwhelming commitment of time and energy. And it's not something that every building can be done with every building. I honestly worked with Historic Ithaca back in the, I don't even know how long ago, 40 years ago, probably. We cleaned bricks for the State Street, State Street brick project. So that, the physical energy involved in taking even a small resource like that and putting it back into a actual use is extraordinary. There was, it just took hours upon hours of time and human involvement. So when it gets down to it, the idea of reuse of the building materials is, unfortunately, from my perspective, going to have to be very selective at first, because you're not going to be able to take your concrete block. You will have no storage for that. That is just not going to happen. The real important things, I mean, I understand your perspective, Andrew, and it's valid. It's very valid, but at the same time, buildings are going down left and right, and you have to take a look at what are you losing in terms of environmental impacts. And I really am worried about that in a large way, because Virginia is the state where I live in Virginia, a lot of the building materials end up. Tompkins County ships its waste to Virginia. So it's like, there are so many issues with this. I really think it's a great opportunity for discussion, but at the same time, I think that there's a lot of giant obstacles that need to be overcome, and I'm happy to add what I know about it to the mix, but at the same time, I think we need to do something about the waste that's being created, but we also need to think about what is practical in this, because until you really have a system in place for managing the reuse, you're not getting the value. That's already true of our plastic waste production. We're not getting the value out of the plastic waste. So why do we create more things that we're not getting the value out of? And I don't mean value monetarily. I mean value in terms of the environment. Anyway, if there could be a way that this could be developed, I think that that would be absolutely great. But at the same time, I think it's going to take many generations for us to get this in order, unless we get a really significant group of people at the highest levels involved in this. It's just not something on people's radar. But I think it's a great opportunity, and I appreciate hearing about the presentation. Thank you.
Looks like Rachel had her hand up next after Barbara.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to thank both Andrew and Gretchen for this presentation. It was really exciting and really important. And I think to the point that was just made that Barbara was making, if I could connect it very tangentially to something that was said yesterday, and I apologize that I can't remember the name of the young person who said this, but talking about a young person being intimidated going into a room with older people, and I'm 20 years younger, and I just want to say I have hope, Barbara, that younger preservationists are going to get us where, and non-preservationists, but just younger people, the next generations are going to get us where you want to go, and they're going to have more care or interest within our capitalist system, the actual economic value you were talking about, but that they're going to get us where we need to go, and they're going to say we need to store this concrete block, and we need to that it will somehow make sense, because it does make sense from an environmental standpoint. And I think our ESF students here are very interested in sustainability and whatnot. So I'm hopeful that in the not too distant future, there will be more energy and more commitment to this. But what I wanted to say when I initially raised my hand was that I agree with what Andy is saying, what Andrew said, that I fear that there will actually, there's I don't know if it's a pivot point, there's a very fine line here where I think a lot of people are going to be like, old growth, I could use that. And I feel like there's not going to be a will to preserve things. It's, there really is going to be people saying, I can monetize that, and I could use those, I could use this. So let's just let it go. Let's let it go. There's more value in reusing it. Maybe that's not inherently a bad thing, but I know from the Chicago area where I'm from, we've had businesses like Salvage One and Architectural Artifacts. Those businesses are huge. They've been around for a long time, and people all over the country shop there because they know if they're looking for a crane sink, designed by Dreyfus, it's there. And the prices are crazy, but they're there. The thing that I'm really worried about is that annihilation of place that you're talking about. Again, coming from the Midwest, I have seen whole neighborhoods of brick buildings in St. Louis, which is a fabulous brick city. And there have been newspaper articles, magazine articles about this for years, about whole blocks slowly just being left to rot. And those are issues of politics and planning and whatever. But, the people are circling the blocks, slowly dismantling, slowly taking St. Louis brick away. And they go on trucks and they go down to Texas. Where does the St. Louis brick go? It's going to Texas. It's going to Louisiana for people to build new McMansions and great outdoor living rooms. amazing things like that. And again, it's great to reuse the brick. It's great to reuse the brick. However, the St. Louis brick is going to these places that have their own brick making traditions. And it just seems like there's a certain lack of will. I've seen this term urban salvage or whatever, urban mining. I've seen it happen in central Illinois where I lived for a long time. The Preservation and Conservation Association of Champaign, where the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign is, they have a small warehouse. Again, it's great for people who are looking for historic materials. It's fantastic in central Illinois. Great resource. But I know that that organization, because I was a member, used to have discussions at its meetings about, should we really be trying to preserve this building? And half the people there, members of this preservation organization, were saying, it's better for us if we just get a sensitive group of people out there to dismantle and salvage and take, we can sell it in our warehouse, and that supports our preservation. And now that, to be honest, now that organization is primarily a salvage organization and not a preservation organization. And that, to me, is sad. And I just want to caution all of us need to be aware that I think that once people see there is value in that and that we can do that, the desire to reuse something in place as a building goes. And it is replaced by the desire to reuse just in terms of materials. Again, not inherently a bad thing, better than going to the dump. But I just feel like a lot of small preservation organizations, especially in communities of that size, Champaign, Urbana, they're focusing their energies on salvage rather than preservation. And I'm concerned about that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts or, how do we combat this? How do we try to maintain a sense of place, and what can we do? I don't know if anyone here has any thoughts about that, but I'm just concerned about salvage becoming the driver. Thanks.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, that was, the gist of my my counterpoint there was me being of two minds about something, which I think you are expressing too, is that ultimately, if there is no other way, maybe the best thing to do is to keep these materials out of the dump and find a meaningful use for them. At the same time, if I put on my Marxist hat for a second, I understand the way that America works, and once value is found in a process, it will become systematized and approached at scale. And that's where, the danger comes in, where, you don't have one family taking apart a single house, Barbara, then you have hundreds of little businesses that are all cashing in on taking apart potentially historic homes in blighted neighborhoods. This is my apocalyptic vision. Okay, this hasn't happened anywhere yet that I'm aware of, but so just to say that, yeah, I am of two minds of it. That's why I think a preservationist who's been properly trained is the best person to have at the tip of this spear, if you want to call it that. I mean, maybe that's a bad analogy, but we should be the ones who are best suited to understand how significant a building is, whether or not it's being wantonly dismantled, or the entire spectrum of possibilities. We have that perspective that I think needs to be inserted in this conversation, because quite frankly, when Professor Heisel asked us he asked Crowd to provide a chapter for deconstruction, and Jenny and I offered to write the counterpoint. In the abstract that he provided us, there was no mention of preservation whatsoever. And not to say that they were ignoring it, but they just didn't think of it. So we need to be there to remind them to think of it. I guess that's all I have to say. Gretchen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just repeat what Andy has said, which is that the call that preservationists need to be part of this conversation from the beginning, from right now, because this will move forward, you know, in some scale, some form, some path. And so rather than coming at it when it's too late and policies and practices have already been established, now is the time for us to become involved and offer ideas. So I love Matthew's idea about potentially certifying materials, you know, and I saw some other ideas in the chat about what the cost of materials, the pricing of materials, who benefits from that. And so, you know, there's no one answer, but I think all of the points that everyone is making right now, coming from a preservationist perspective, are so important to this conversation, which is already involving architects and engineers and demolition contractors and city governments and all of these other stakeholders. And so preservationists, as an important stakeholder group, need to really be there to participate very actively in these conversations that are going on right now in different parts of the country and the world.